Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to start covering what exactly is supply. And furthermore, we're going to be focusing predominantly on what causes changes in supply. So this is going to be the first page of your supply PDF. All right. So to get into it, first we need to think of what supply is. Supply is different from demand. Demand deals with consumers, as in what does a person buy? Now, producers are different and very, very important to our economy as well. See, producers make the things that we want to buy. Remember, without producers, you don't have consumers. Now, supply is a very simple concept, but I want you to be cognizant and think about this that you're going to have to take a different position on this. You have to think of yourself as a producer. It's a lot easier to think of always liking low prices, but think if you're selling something, you would prefer higher prices. They would encourage you to do more of something. And many of you guys are producers already. An example of this is a lot of you guys produce and sell your labor, as in you have a job where someone gives you money and you supply them with your labor. And if I were to, let's say, pay you more, would you work more hours or less? The answer to that is you would supply more labor. So that's how supply works. You have to take yourself as in, I own a business and I want to make money, and not I want to buy a good and I want to pay as little as possible. A lot of it is very different in that aspect. As in, your employer is your consumer of your labor. They would love to pay you less, but you won't work for less. If they paid you more, you would probably put in more hours. An example I would be using with you guys is asking you if I was going to pay you a certain amount of money to go home and bake a tray of muffins. Now, if you were going to bake that tray of muffins, you would have to supply the land, labor, and capital to do it. You'd have to have your own muffin pans, an oven, and house. You'd have to provide your own land, as in all the ingredients and the sugar and the flour and the um, the eggs, water, all those other things. You'd also have to provide all of the labor. You'd have to provide either yourself or you'd have to pay someone to produce these muffins for you. And if I paid you more money per tray of muffins to make, you would probably devote more of your time and effort and resources to make more muffins. So if I said, hey, I'll pay you $5 a tray of muffins, well, if it takes you half an hour to make a tray of muffins, well, that's $10 an hour minus the cost of making it. You may make some, you may not. You may make very few because it wouldn't be worth your time. But if I went ahead and said, I'll pay you $8 a tray, well, that's $16. Your cost would be about $3. That's $13 an hour you'd be making. That might be worth it. If I was going to pay you $15 a tray, okay, $30. That's $3 cost extra. So you get $26 an hour. I bet then you'd probably work the whole day, maybe around the clock. You might even go and hire friends and other people to and use their kitchens and get more land, labor, and capital to produce more. But then if I dropped it back down and said, you know what, I'm only going to pay you $4 a tray, you'd probably cease producing altogether and supply would decrease. So to kind of give you an idea of what supply looks like and how it works, we'll go ahead and take a quick look here at what a supply curve looks like. Think of it this way. If I was paying you $5 per tray, you guys as a whole, as all the producers in a market, might produce 60 trays of muffins. But if I increased it to $7, you guys might go ahead and then produce 80 trays. It means as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases too. That's why the supply curve is upward sloping. That means it's a positive relationship. If the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. If the price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases as well. So this is essentially what we will be looking at here and how supply works. Remember, you have to think of owning your own business and selling your own goods and providing your own labor. And then supply becomes simple. You got to get out of your consumer shoes and into a producer's shoes. All right. Now, you should have a good idea of what supply is. Remember, supply means that as I change the price, I change the quantity supplied, which is really important as we get into changes in supply. Because price, just like in demand, price changes the quantity supplied. It does not move supply. The supply curve is not moving when I change the price. We're just going up and down the supply curve. So if I go from 5 to 7, then I went and increased the price, and the price changes the quantity supplied. Remember, not supply. So price always changes quantity supplied. That's always the rule. Okay, so now we can kind of get onto our worksheet here where I have our supply curves and everything there. You should already have your name, period, and date already filled in. But what is the law of supply? Well, this is very simple, almost as simple as the law of demand. The law of supply means as the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied of the good increases as well. Also, it means the law of supply is as the price of a good decreases, the quantity supplied or the amount people make decreases as well. It's exactly what the supply curve shows you right here. So that's what the law of supply is. It means as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases. And as the price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases. And keep in mind, I keep saying quantity supplied. We're not changing supply yet until we get to this box. So you might be asking, what is a change in supply then? Because that's what everyone says. Yep, a lot of people say, hey, if you increase the price, that'll increase supply. And they're wrong. It increases the quantity supplied. Price always affects quantity supplied, just like it affects quantity demanded. Things that change supply, just like a change in demand, need to be an external factor. So we have price here and we have quantity. That's how you always know price changes quantity supplied. But sometimes there's other things that'll increase or decrease the amount people will supply. And that's what we're going to be covering as we kind of go on in our through this page. And you can see 7 things that I provided that would change supply. So what is a change in supply? Well, a change in supply is when producers will supply more or less of a good at the same price or at every price. There's 2 ways to say that, just like in demand. So if you've done your demand sheet, this should be actually pretty easy. So people will supply more or less of a good at the same price or at every price. And you can kind of see how this works here. If the price of a good was $2 right here, initially we'd be at S1, which is supply 1. And people make this quantity 1. Let's make that, I don't know, make up a number, make that 30. So at $2, they'd make 30 widgets, just a made-up good. But if we decrease supplies and shift it to the left, we can get to this new curve here called S2. So that means that it's harder to produce, and therefore, there'll be less of a good supplied. So we move from S1 to S2, and now we're at Q2 right here, because at $2, people will supply less. And let's say this is 20. So at $2, we were making 30 of a good, and now at the same price, because some external factor has changed, we're producing less, okay? So in other words, it means that as the price of a good goes, well, this is where you can see. Let's say as the price of a good goes up, suppliers will produce more of the good. However, you could also go ahead and put right here, if the price of a good goes down, suppliers will produce less of a good. Remember, they're always going to go the same way, what happens with price. Okay, so that's actually more a definition of changing quantity supplied. All right, the next thing we need to do, and I'm going to give you a moment right here, is what's the difference between changing quantity supplied and a change in supply? Remember, a change in quantity supplied is going to, that didn't line up right. A change in quantity supplied is changed by price. So price always changes the quantity supplied, but a change in supply is an external factor like rising cost of inputs or technology and future expectations of price, which we'll get to then. So remember, a change in quantity supplied means that the price changes the quantity. a change in supply means that people are producing more or less of a good at the same price or at every price. All right. So the last thing we're going to do on this worksheet, which will probably take the most time, is going through the things that will actually change supply. And I've listed several from here, so we'll go through them in order. The first one here is the rising cost of inputs. Now, one thing to always think about when we're talking about changes in supply is this. Supply, or how much you're going to produce, if we're not going to involve price, it always is determined by how easy or difficult it is to make something. As in, if you're going to supply your labor, as in you want a job, and I say, I'm going to hire you at the job and I'll pay you $10 an hour. And I go, how many hours a week would you work for $10 an hour? And you say like 25. I'm like, cool. So I get 25. So you'd produce 25 hours of labor for $10 an hour. Okay, there's my price, there's my quantity. But what if I went and said, all right, but the job's in Orlando. So you're going to have to drive to Orlando and back every day. Now you might start reconsidering things because that increase your cost of producing your labor. You're going to have to drive a lot more. You're going to have to pay more in gas. That's a lot more of your time. And therefore you'd probably be like, actually, maybe I only want to work 10 hours a week. That's not really worth it for me to be driving out there many, many times a week. Also, if I made you pay for your uniforms or there was an increase in taxes and other things. But on the other hand, if I made it easier for you, as in if there was more technology, as in if I gave you a flying car that could get you to Orlando really fast, you would start supplying more hours because I made it easier. So the big thing to think of when we're talking about changes in supply is cost. If it makes it harder for you to produce, supply will decrease. If it makes it easier for you to produce, supply will increase. So let's go ahead and go back here to rising cost of inputs. Inputs are INPUTS, and they're what you put into making something. For example, if we go back to muffins, my inputs might be my land, labor, and capital. So let's imagine that if I'm making muffins, all of a sudden flour and sugar are more expensive. At the same price, would I want to make more muffins or less muffins? The answer to that is I'd want to make less. If it's more expensive for me to produce it, that means I'm not getting the additional profit when I sell it. I'm getting less. And so it's not worth my time to put in that extra effort. I would want to make the same amount of muffins, but I'd want to raise my price then. But the market may or may not agree with that. But now I'm making the same amount at a different price, and that's still a change in supply. So the rising cost of inputs means as inputs or things I need to make the good increase in price, supply will decrease. Also, it doesn't have to be rising costs. Sometimes it could be on sale. For example, if I want to make muffins and sugar and flour are BOGO at Publix, I'll get a lot more flour and sugar, and then I'll come and make a lot more muffins because my input costs have decreased, and it's easier for me to make them. So that's your rising cost of inputs. The next one we'll come over is technology. Now, I know you're probably thinking technology means something to the effect of computers and programs and software, and it can be those things, but it could be anything that makes it easier to produce something. For example, you might have a conventional oven at home, and that conventional oven takes like 30 minutes to bake your muffins. But if you had a convection oven that actually blows hot air around your oven, you can actually have a lower temperature and bake your muffins faster. So that means instead of it taking 30 minutes in the oven, it could take 20 minutes in the oven, and you could make a lot more muffins. So if I add a new technology, supply will always increase and shift to the right. So technology increases production because increases supply because it lowers your costs. It makes it easier to produce, so you supply more. So technology is anything that makes you more efficient in producing a good. So it can be computers, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be me reorganizing the order, how I mix the ingredients, or just kind of a new way of kind of cooling them on a cooling rack or a new tray. So it can be anything, but it has to be something that increases how productive you are. So that's your technology right there. All right, right here, we have two things that can affect supply, and that would be taxes and subsidies, and they're right here. So taxes is when the government forces you to pay money. And in this case, we're talking about an excise tax, and that means you have to pay money every time you produce something. So if you were making muffins and I said, yeah, you're going to have to pay 45 cents every time you make a muffin to the government, would you supply more muffins then or less? The answer to that would be less. So if I tax you more to produce something, you will probably supply less. If I reduce your taxes, you would probably supply more. So an excise tax in this case means it's a tax, it's a per unit tax. Every time you make something, you have to pay money to the government to produce it. And that would cost you more to make it. Therefore, you'd supply less. The supply curve would shift to the left. So that's how a tax would affect supply. Now, the other word we have here is subsidies. And what a subsidy is a subsidy is a payment from the government for you to produce something. That means if you're making muffins and there's a subsidy, they would pay you money, extra money, every time you make a muffin. So if the government comes in and goes, hey, I'm going to pay you 25 cents every time you make a muffin, and you can then sell it to someone else. So you get 25 cents more for every muffin just because you made it. That means you would probably supply more muffins. Think, if I get paid extra money to make something, that means my costs have decreased. And remember, if my costs have decreased, I will supply more of something. It's kind of like if the government paid you an extra $2 an hour every time you worked, you'd probably supply more labor. Okay, so taxes and subsidies are really simple. If I tax you to do something, costs go up, you will supply less. If I give you a subsidy, I pay you money to produce something, therefore your costs decreased and you will supply more, and that'll increase. All right, now this one's a little bit tricky. This is called future expectations of price. Now, future expectations of price is how suppliers look to the future and try to think about what they're going to produce. So here's the thing. If you're producing muffins and let's say that they would keep, they don't go bad immediately, okay? So you can store them in a warehouse. If you expect the price of the muffins to increase next week, what happens to the amount of muffins you would supply now? Okay, this one's a little bit tricky. So if I'm getting $1 a muffin today, but next week I'll get $2 a muffin, the amount I supply right now would decrease. And I know you might go, that's not what I was thinking. And fair enough. But remember, we're talking about now versus the future. That doesn't mean I've shut down my factory. In fact, I would keep making muffins. What I wouldn't be doing is selling them. And to supply a good, you have to offer it for sale. So if I make muffins and put in my warehouse, I've supplied no muffins. But next week, when the price goes up, I will go ahead and put all those muffins on the market, and therefore I would sell a lot more. But right now, because remember, we talk about future expectations, we're always looking at how that affects me today. So if the price will increase in the future, I will supply less now. Or I can think about if I'm getting $1 a muffin this week, but next week I'll get 50 cents a muffin, I would increase production of muffins now and sell all the muffins I can this week while I get $1 a muffin. Then when I get 50 cents later, next week, where I would produce less. So it's always what's happening now. So if the price is going to decrease in the future, I will supply more now. If I think the price is going to increase in the future, I'm going to supply less now, and therefore I can supply them more in the future. But now I'll make less of them. So that's your future expectations of price. If you expect the price to increase in the future, you will supply less now. And if you expect the price to decrease in the future, you would supply more now. We're always looking at now. What's happening now in our market? Okay, and here's our last three here. This would be government regulations. It could also, you could put increased regulation or decreased, but regulations can go either way. Remember, regulations are pretty much programs typically made by the government, but it can be other organizations too, that make producers, it tends to make them have to do extra stuff when they make a good. For example, if you are making muffins and you're producing them and selling them, but I said, look, we want food to be safe. So every time you make a batch of muffins, you're going to have to take it to the government inspector's office and have them inspect it for about 30 minutes. So every tray of muffins, you then have to stop producing. You have to go to the government. You're like, hey, look at these. They take one of your muffins, take it apart, analyze it, and they go, okay, this is good to go. Then you could sell it. Would that increase your cost of making a tray of muffins or decrease it? The answer is that would increase it. If you had to shut down your restaurant every week for a health inspection, well, that would increase your cost, and therefore you would supply less. Also, if the government rolled back those regulations and said, all right, we're only going to inspect your restaurant like twice a year now, well, decreased regulations means it is now reduce your cost of producing, and you would supply more. Now, I'm not here to say that all regulations are bad and terrible and we shouldn't have any. What I'm saying is that regulations have a cost. Do we want safe food? Well, we're going to want to inspect restaurants, and that's going to be a cost. So they'll probably raise their prices. So there's an effect to every regulation that we have. So government regulations are if I increase regulations, that will decrease supply. If I decrease regulations, that would increase supply. So if you pull regulations back, businesses are more free to produce, and it reduces their costs and they'll make more. So that's regulations. All right, this one is a very simple one. It simply is the number of producers. If there's more producers of a good, they will make, well, more goods at every price. So if I had a classroom full of you guys and I said, how many muffins would you make? You might make me like 40 trays of muffins if I was giving you 50 cents a muffin. But what if I brought more producers in? I brought the class across the hall and the one next door, and I got them in there and said, I'll give you 50 cents a muffin. Instead of making the 40 trays of muffins that one class would make, now that I have more people to produce, I'd probably get like 130 trays of muffins just because there's more producers. So if the number of producers increases, I will produce more muffins. If the numbers of producers decrease, I will supply less muffins. That's simply how number of producers work. More producers, increase supply. Fewer producers, decrease supply. And the last one here is very simple, and it deals with productivity. What productivity is, it's how productive you are. Now, this can take a wide range of things, so it's kind of a catch-all down there. It means that if my workers become more skilled, educated, experienced, if I find new ways to produce something, if for any reason I can produce more of something, I will increase supply. And if somehow my productivity levels decrease, my workers are sad or they're lazy or sick, my productivity levels would decrease. So productivity just means if I'm more productive, that would increase supply. And if I'm less productive, that would decrease supply. It's a simple catch-all. Now, what we're going to be covering next week is going over supply elasticity, which if you already did demand elasticity is going to be a cinch, but then we're going to get into one of the most important things that we're going to cover, which is equilibrium. So look forward to seeing you guys again. Take care, and I'll see you next time.